Welcome to the speed briefing on the Practical Toolkit on international protection for people displaced across borders in the context of climate change and disasters. I'm Professor Geoff Gilbert of the University of Essex, and I'm joined by Isabelle Michal from the Division of International Protection of UNHCR. I plan to speak for about 12 minutes. Isabelle will then follow, providing a UNHCR perspective, after which we throw the floor open for questions and comments. Please put them in the chat. The speed briefing is being recorded and will appear on Essex's YouTube channel for those who could not join us at this time. It's now trite to say that there are no such thing as climate refugees, but that is not the question. What is important is, when does the law of international protection offer guarantees to forcibly displaced persons affected by climate or disaster? Everyone is affected by climate change, and that includes refugees and asylum seekers, sometimes after they've been initially displaced across an international border. To quote Professor Jane McAdam, however, the impacts of climate change and disasters interact with other social, economic, and political drivers of displacement. In other words, they are part of the hazardscape that creates risks for people. This means that while there is no such thing as a climate refugee, there are most certainly people who are placed at heightened risk because the impacts of climate change or disasters generate or exacerbate a risk of persecution or other serious harm. This practical toolkit evolved from the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies at the University of California College of Law in San Francisco's 2023 Practice Advisory analyzing asylum claims for individuals fleeing climate change or environmental disasters. The idea to provide a global version came from discussions between CGRS, the Kaldor Center at UNSW, and Essex Law School and Human Rights Centre, which we then presented to UNHCR. The toolkit is part of a pledge made by the 3 academic institutions at the Global Refugee Forum, December 2023. It is designed for use by lawyers, judges, decision makers, and policy makers. It is hoped that national versions akin to CGRS's practice advisory might be developed, and we are happy to answer any questions going forward. The toolkit applies existing international protection frameworks to the context of climate change and disasters. There's no need to develop new law. The bedrock is, as ever, the 1951 Convention and its 1967 Protocol that need to be read particularly in the light of UNHCR's 2020 guidance, legal considerations regarding claims for international protection made in the context of the adverse effects of climate change and disasters. What that document and the toolkit make clear is that climate change and disasters are part of the hazardscape that affect whether someone needs international protection because it would not be safe to return them to their country of nationality. The toolkit also addresses the expanded definitions of refugee status found in Africa and the Americas, along with the complementary protection regimes found in international and regional human rights law frameworks. There is an emerging body of case law at the international level, before regional bodies, and before several domestic courts. The toolkit is founded on 5 key considerations listed here, and they underpin why there is no need to develop new law. As stated, the toolkit shows how existing international refugee law and international human rights law provide international protection when forced displacement includes elements of climate change and disaster. The key considerations need to be read as a whole. They interact, but of all of them, key considerations 4 and 5 are the ones that practitioners need to remember. To look for the role of human agency in any consequences of climate change or disaster, and the manifestation of risk over time. Regional mechanisms are provided other ways of providing protection. And since this presentation is for countries in Europe and African time zones, we're going to look at the regional mechanisms of Africa and then of Europe. Starting with Africa, for detail on Africa and how the 69 extended definition of refugee status, with its reference to events seriously disturbing public order, would apply to persons where their flight was affected by climate change or disaster, please see Hansen Lowry, which is in UNHCR's PPLA legal research series and can be downloaded for free. It provides a very full and comprehensive analysis. Please note that public order in the phrase events seriously disturbing public order is a translation of the French ordre public, so it is not the same as Anglo-American public order. Rather, it goes to a breakdown in the state systems. As such, the clear link with the aftermath of a climate event or a disaster is obvious. What is also interesting is how the African Commission on Human and People's Rights in 2023 held that the term refugee may also include persons who are compelled to leave their country of nationality as a result of climate change that affects their fundamental rights, regardless of whether such effects seriously disturb public order. That is a broader reading of refugee protection by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Europe is a little bit messier, as we all know, because there are so many different regimes and there isn't as much cohesion between national approaches. The European Union Qualification Directive of recast 2011, which applies within the European Union and is due to be replaced by a regulation in 2026, does not expand the definition of refugee status, unlike the approaches in Africa and the Americas, but it does create subsidiary protection where there is a substantial risk of serious harm, which for this purpose covers the same ground as Articles 2 and 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, except that one can be excluded from subsidiary protection. You cannot be excluded from the European Convention on Human Rights. So far, the European Court of Human Rights has dealt with climate change and human rights only with respect to duties of member states to people in the member state. See Klammer Seniorinnen Schweiz and others against Switzerland of 2020. That's not particularly relevant to sending people back to a country affected by climate change or disaster. For that sort of case, the court has relied on the so-called health cases, where treatment would not be as good as it would be in Europe. That is insufficient. And the mere fact that the government in the country in question does not have the resources does not render it a breach by the Council of Europe member state to return them. That's Sufi and Elmi. The later cases of Papashvili and Savran show some positive developments, but the entire approach is ignoring key consideration 4 on human agency in responses. The European Convention on Human Rights, though, and the court, is forward-looking in assessing risk. National courts have provided broader protection within Europe. There's not much to add here other than to say that the national courts are more progressive than the Court of Justice of the European Union and the European Court of Human Rights. To give one example, the Tribunal of Milan has found in a Bangladeshi case that severe flooding, erosion and landslides in the applicant's place of origin, which had already resulted in the applicant being displaced from his home multiple times, generated a serious risk of violations of the applicant's rights to life, physical integrity, health, a healthy environment, food and housing. It held that these risks amounted to inhuman and degrading treatment, and that the applicant was disproportionately affected due to his belonging to a disadvantaged social class. In holding that the risk posed to the applicant by environmental factors constituted treatment, the tribunal found that the risk had been aggravated by the state's failure to implement effective environmental risk management policies or basic assistance programs for affected populations. That brings me to the end of my part of the presentation. We hope, that is the authors of the Practical Toolkit, that going through it will help decision makers, practitioners, policymakers, and please recognize there is global applicability. You might focus on your particular region, but look at the other regions. They have developed the law in interesting ways that go beyond what is seen in individual regions. And then remember, there is domestic applicability. Thank you for listening. We hope the toolkit will be of great use. After Isabelle has spoken, we will move to the question and answer. I'm now going to stop sharing.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. My name is Isabelle Michal. I'm working with the UNHCR. I'm based in Geneva, working in the Division of International Protection. And I'm focusing exclusively on legal and normative development to protect people who cross borders in the context of climate change impacts and disasters. So thanks, Geoff, for the introduction and the legal principle that you indeed introduced. So I just want to explain in a few words why is climate change impacts and related displacement a protection issue for UNHCR. Indeed, as you highlighted, Geoff, climate change impacts affect people's lives, and they contribute to new displacement in some circumstances or risk of new displacement. And indeed, as you mentioned, some people cross border in this context, and some might be in need of international protection. But also during displacement, where people are living in displacement situation, climate change impacts also have the potential to increase protection risks that people might face. And this is also an area where UNHCR intervenes. Then, when people are being displaced, climate change impacts have the potential to hinder prospects for the search for durable solutions, for instance, to return to areas that may have become uninhabitable or where natural resources become scarcer. So for all these reasons, climate change impacts interact with protection risks and protection issues in the context of displacement. So UNHCR has a supervisory role over the implementation of refugee instrument based on its statutes. And this is in fulfillment of the supervisory role that in 2020, UNHCR issued legal considerations regarding claims for international protection arising in the context of climate change impacts and disasters that Geoff just presented. In 2023, to go beyond this work, UNHCR issued a note on climate change, international refugee law, and UNHCR's mandate that provides concrete examples that illustrates the application of the criteria described in the legal considerations in specific climate change impacted situations in different regions of the world. So it's clear that for UNHCR, it's a priority to disseminate guidance in this area and to strengthen capacities of state, non-state, partners, legal practitioners, judges, and all actors who are involved and who deal with actual asylum claims that may arise in the context of climate change impacts and disasters in interaction with other drivers of displacement. UNHCR cooperates with researchers and universities, and to continue to better understand what people experience in this context, and to inform application of refugee instruments to protect people in need. And of course, UNHCR is also advocating for the application of international refugee and human rights law wherever it's relevant, and intervenes in global and regional policy discussions to ensure policy coherence and to equip partners who are involved in this discussion to do so. UNHCR is working in partnership with other actors in broader human mobility dimension in relation to climate change impacts, because obviously not all people who move in this context will be in need of international protection. And it's key to ensure that all people in need can have access to international protection, but that all people in general have access to the enjoyment of their human rights. It's also important to ensure that policy frameworks are in line with international protection law, as just described by Geoff. This is why this practical toolkit is so important. Doctrinal guidance needs to be implemented in the field and reach people in need to ensure that persons who are the most vulnerable are able to get the international protection that they need. UNHCR has been cooperating with TGRS, with the University of Essex and the Kaldor Center on International Refugee Law, and we are extremely grateful for the work that has been achieved with that. This toolkit is the result of several consultations that included people working in the field, legal practitioners, and people who are liaising and in contact with persons in need and who are dealing with these claims. We are extremely hopeful that the toolkit will help implement UNHCR's legal consideration and ensure more effective protection for people displaced in need in the context of climate change impacts. So as you have understood, this is a collective task, and this is an evolving work. We need to hear from you. We need to hear from all actors in the field to better understand and continue discuss on what people who are impacted by climate change impacts experience in the field and what their international protection needs are. So UNHCR stands firmly committed to continue working in close partnership with you all and to protect people displaced in need of international protection in all contexts. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I should point out that Isabelle is having a problem with her camera, and that is why she did not come on screen the way that I am here. Could I also point out it may be a Zoom thing, but if you can't use chat to put your questions, please use the Q&A at the bottom. And we already have a question from Emily Rowe about what is something that we've been talking about now for ages. And I'm going to give an example from Essex's engagement with UNHCR, which is the flawed bright line distinction between naturally occurring, and please note, Emily put naturally occurring in inverted commas, drought on the one hand and parties to conflict on the other, in the key case of Sufi and Elmi. Okay. Can I start with another part of this work? I'm a lawyer, but when I'm working in this field, I work with a whole load of people in other disciplines. I have colleagues in the computer science department at Essex, and we have worked with the innovation service at UNHCR, looking at how to use artificial intelligence to help with prevention and predictability. One of those concerned using infrared satellite imagery to explore vegetation degradation on a particular border, so that when other indicators suggested movement might be forthcoming, that UNHCR could predict at which point on this long border people would be crossing, because they could see the vegetation degradation, they could look at the other indicators, and that would suggest, which meant that in the reception country, which was also facing problems of a similar nature, they could place their resources in advance. This, of course, is done in the field as a practical response to people moving across borders. And I think what came out from Isabelle's presentation is how UNHCR has to work in that way, because people on the move naturally are seen as coming within UNHCR's mandate until someone says, actually, the law doesn't extend that far. But in this case, what tends to happen is, and this is what Emily's question raises, is there a distinction between, quotes, naturally occurring disasters and other factors which do fall within UNHCR's mandate? I think one of the things that, if you read the Practical Toolkit, we do not believe in naturally occurring disasters or climate change. There is human agency at various levels, and that human agency affects climate, it creates disasters. The other thing to take into account is quite often climate events or disasters exacerbate the context in which the displacement is occurring. So, for instance, does drought lead to conflict between herders and farmers, for instance? And those distinctions between herders and farmers also reflect ethnic distinctions within a particular country. So you immediately have membership of a particular social group, conflict, alongside climate or disaster. And what was discovered with our research with the Innovation Service, when they went and asked people in the field, was that the people who were crossing the border would often come out, when they were asked why did they cross, with 3 or 4 different sorts of reasons, one of which would be climate or disaster, and the others would be much more those that fall within 1951 Convention, 1967 Protocol, or in this particular case, the 1969 African Convention. While I haven't given a response about Sufi and Elmi, I think my response would suggest that I think Sufi and Elmi is outdated, does not reflect current thinking on how one should view climate in the context of displacement. And to my mind, the entire hazardscape, as Jay McAdam has brilliantly phrased it, needs to be taken into account. Anybody else wishing to put a question in the Q&A, please do. But what I would, while we're waiting, just in case, can I ask, Isabelle, you referred to UNHCR being asked for guidance in these matters. Do you want to respond to Emily's question, but do you also want to add in any other situations where UNHCR is asked to give guidance on its mandate and climate and disaster? You did a bit in your presentation, but I think now that we've got Emily's example, it might be useful if you could expand on that, or even just expand on Emily's question. I hand it to you.
Thanks a lot, Geoff, and thanks, Emily, for your question. And I completely echo what you just explained, Geoff, that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. Disaster can be linked to natural hazards, but there's always a human dimension to a disaster. Just for the reference, UNDRR defines a disaster as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community due to hazardous events that can indeed be natural, that interact with conditions of exposure of a community, of their vulnerability, and their capacity to cope with this hazard. And we talk about a disaster when these coping mechanisms are overwhelmed and that there's, as a consequence, a disruption of the functioning of the society. So you see that there's always a human element and decisions that we can take either to prepare for a disaster, to respond to a disaster, and to cope with this. And there is a resilience of the community, and there's a leverage here. So indeed, as you say, you quote naturally occurring growth, and we see here that there's this concept. But you mentioned also the link with conflict, and I mean there are always several drivers in situations, and displacement situations are always complex scenarios, and I think this is also what the toolkit meant to show. We are responding to complex situations and try to identify needs for international protection indeed. In 2018, UNHCR issued a research paper that was called In Harm's Way, that looked at situations where people were being displaced across borders, where there was a nexus between climate change impacts and disasters, and a conflict or violence. And indeed, there were several case studies in this research that I will put in the chat just after. And it looked in particular at the situation of Somalis who fled famine situation in relation to the drought in 2018, and who crossed border into neighboring countries. And it showed that indeed states who hosted those people recognized their protection needs and provided indeed a protection to those people. So there are a certain number of good practices where this situation have been recognized, and that also inform our research. Thanks. Over.
And I think that raises one other issue. We think in global north in Europe, particularly of these cases coming about at the legal level across the world, and we've seen this in our research with respect to Asia, Americas, and Africa. Quite often, these are cases where governments are making decisions to be more expansive in their understanding of who is a refugee without it necessarily going to a court. So I think at that level, one needs to bear in mind that what we could really do with is seeing this practice adopted through judicial mechanisms, regional, international, and national, so that it becomes part of the lawyer's way of thinking and not just the practitioner's way of thinking. I think lawyers quite often, focus just on courts. There's another question in the chat. Got another two questions in the chat. ESDPO. While have you observed uses of this? Yes. So to answer the question from one of the anonymous attendees, we did see cases both in the Americas and in Africa of events seriously disturbing public order being used, but I think, as Isabelle's previous answer just made clear, it isn't ever going to be just in relation to climate. Climate is one factor that promotes displacement. And so when we see events seriously disturbing public order, quite often we're seeing climate or disaster alongside other factors that might or might not have given rise to refugee status. And we see it particularly or these contexts where you've got a range of displacement, where some people are internally displaced and some people are then also displaced across a border. So I think the entire context of climate, disaster, displacement needs to be read as a whole. And the answer is, to Somerset, the answer is yes, this will be put on hold. You will see that there is a third person on the screen, Kat Freeman. Kat is my saviour in all things to do with Zoom. And once we have been recording, and once this webinar has been closed, and we're about to do that, it will shortly go up on Essex's YouTube channel, and we will work out a way of making that known. We will possibly find a way to put this information out in the same place that we put out the registration, so that you can then view this after the event. But please don't ask me how that happens. It will happen, okay? But not from me. I did want to thank Kat, who has made this event possible. On that basis, with no more questions in the chat, could I thank you all for attending? We will be making this available online. Isabelle, thank you so much for showing up and for being so willing to share UNHCR's experience. Thank you, everybody. Isabelle, do you wish to say anything to conclude?
Thank you, and thank to you, Geoff, for this work in general. And I hope the toolkit will be very helpful to deal with asylum claims. And we want to hear from you. Don't hesitate to give feedback. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We're now going to finish. Goodbye for now.